Tom had never been one to take unnecessary risks, but tonight was different. It was late, almost midnight, and the storm had been raging for hours. His co-workers had offered him a ride, but Tom, exhausted from the long day at the office, just wanted to clear his head. The walk home was only about 2 miles, and he figured the fresh air would do him good. As he stepped out into the rain, he immediately regretted his decision. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees like a wild animal. He pulled his coat tighter around him and began walking. The road ahead was barely visible in the darkness, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning. The streets were empty, and the usual sounds of the city were drowned out by the storm. It was just him and the road, a long, winding stretch of asphalt that seemed to go on forever. The streetlights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced in the periphery of his vision. Tom shook his head, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that gnawed at the edges of his mind. About half a mile into his walk, Tom began to notice things. Small things at first. An odd rustling in the bushes, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. He told himself it was just the wind or his tired mind playing tricks on him. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step. He quickened his pace, his footsteps splashing through puddles that seemed to multiply by the minute. The storm was relentless, and the road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. He reached a point where the streetlights were spaced farther apart, leaving long stretches of the road in complete darkness. It was in one of these dark stretches that Tom first heard it, the sound of footsteps behind him. He stopped dead in his tracks, his heart pounding in his chest. The footsteps stopped too, a split second after his. He turned around, squinting into the darkness, but saw nothing, just the empty road and the shadows cast by the trees lining the sidewalk. "Hello!" he called out, his voice barely audible over the storm. No answer. He waited a moment longer before shaking his head and continuing down the road. It was just the rain, he told himself. Just the sound of the rain. But the footsteps returned, this time louder, closer. He spun around again, but once more, there was nothing. The road behind him was empty, the shadows undisturbed. Tom's heart raced, and he could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He was being followed, he was sure of it. But by what, or who, he had no idea. Tom resumed his walk, this time at a brisk pace. He kept glancing over his shoulder, but each time he did, the road remained empty. The footsteps, however, continued. They were faint, barely more than a whisper against the roar of the storm, but they were there, always there, just out of sight. As he passed under one of the few functioning streetlights, he caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye. A shadow, darker than the night itself, seemed to flit across the road and disappear into the trees. Tom froze, his breath catching in his throat. He stared at the spot where the shadow had vanished, his mind racing. There was no one there, no one he could see, at least. But the feeling of being watched was now overwhelming, an almost physical presence pressing down on him from all sides. Without thinking, Tom broke into a run. He sprinted down the road, his footsteps echoing loudly in the empty night. The rain lashed at his face and the wind howled around him, but he didn't care. All he knew was that he had to get away, had to get home. But no matter how fast he ran, the footsteps kept pace. They were right behind him now, almost in sync with his own. He could feel the presence growing stronger, closer, until it felt like it was right on top of him. Finally, he saw it, a faint glow in the distance. His house, salvation. He pushed himself harder, his legs burning with the effort, and as he neared the house, he dared to glance over his shoulder one last time. What he saw nearly made him trip and fall. A figure, cloaked in darkness, was following him. Its form was barely distinguishable from the night, but its eyes, glowing with an unnatural light, were locked onto him. Tom's blood ran cold. Tom reached his front door and fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The footsteps were right behind him now, so close he could almost feel the breath of whatever was chasing him on the back of his neck. Finally, he managed to unlock the door and throw it open. He stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind him. For a moment, all was silent. The only sound was his own ragged breathing and the pounding of his heart. He listened intently, waiting for the sound of footsteps outside the door. But there was nothing, just the storm, raging outside. Tom leaned against the door, trying to catch his breath. He was safe now. Whatever had been following him was gone. But just as he began to relax, he heard a noise that made his blood run cold, a soft, almost imperceptible creak from upstairs. He wasn't alone. Tom's heart hammered in his chest as he slowly turned to face the staircase. The house was dark, the power out due to the storm, but he could make out the faint outline of the stairs leading up to the second floor. And there, at the top of the stairs, was a shadow. It was the same figure he had seen outside, the one that had been following him. But now it was inside his house, standing at the top of the stairs, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Tom backed away slowly, his mind racing. How had it gotten inside? What did it want? He had no answers, only the growing sense of dread that threatened to consume him. The figure began to move, slowly descending the stairs, its eyes never leaving him. Tom stumbled backward, his hand searching for something, anything to defend himself with. His fingers brushed against a lamp on the table and he grabbed it, holding it out in front of him like a weapon. But the figure didn't stop. It continued to advance, its movement slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. Tom's breath came in short, panicked gasps as he backed into the corner of the room, the lamp held uselessly in his trembling hands. The figure was almost upon him now, its eyes glowing with an eerie, malevolent light. Tom could feel the coldness emanating from it, a chill that seeped into his bones and froze him in place. Just as the figure reached him, there was a flash of lightning, illuminating the room for a brief moment. In that instant, Tom saw the figure clearly, its face twisted into a grotesque mask of hatred and anger, its eyes burning with a fire that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. Tom screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the storm. The figure reached out, its cold, clammy hands closing around his throat. Tom struggled, but it was no use. The figure was too strong, its grip like iron. As the world began to fade to black, Tom's last thought was of the road, the storm, and the shadow that had followed him home. Tom awoke to silence. The storm had passed, and the house was eerily quiet. He was lying on the floor, the lamp still clutched in his hand. But the figure was gone. There was no sign of it anywhere. He sat up slowly, his head pounding and his throat sore. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the storm? Tom didn't know. But as he looked around the room, he saw something that made his blood run cold. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like blood, were the words, "You can't escape." Tom's breath caught in his throat. He scrambled to his feet and ran to the door, throwing it open and stepping out into the morning light. The storm had left the world fresh and clean, but Tom knew that he was not safe. He could feel it in his bones, in the chill that lingered in the air. As he looked back at the house, he saw the figure standing in the doorway, its eyes glowing with that same eerie light. Tom turned and ran, not stopping until he was far from the house, far from the road, far from the nightmare that had followed him home. But no matter how far he ran, he knew that it was still out there, waiting for him, watching. And one day, it would come for him again.